Hey boys and girls. So today I'm going to be making some bread with you guys. I'm pretty excited about it. I haven't really had a chance to do much baking this winter, so I'm excited to start spring off with a little bit of extra pastry making, cookies. We made pretzel bagels, just like good times all around. But before we get started on making just a regular plain old loaf of bread, we're going to go over a little bit about what makes bread bread. And we're gonna do a little experiment with yeast so that we can see why bread gets so light and fluffy and airy and kind of understand a little bit of the science behind that. So just a sec. All right, for this little experiment, we're gonna be using 2 water bottles and we are gonna fill them with a yeast and sugar solution and compare the results between yeast that we gave sugar and yeast that we did not give sugar. What's really important here, if you guys notice, I am checking the temperature of the water. Yeast prefers to live in water between 100 degrees and 110 degrees. Anything more than that and it'll hurt the yeast. Anything less than that and it'll be too cold and sleepy to get anything done. So we are going to be taking our yeast here and mixing about a teaspoon of it into 1 cup here and 1 cup here of warm water. And we are going to feed one of the yeast a tablespoon of sugar. And we are going to compare in our water bottles and see how much of the carbon dioxide that they produce so we can see which will be more effective when we make our bread later on. So we are just going to start with a teaspoon. If you notice, I got my nice little measure here. Leveled out approximately, flat into 1 cup. And then we are going to take a teaspoon of the yeast and level that out into 1 cup. And then level it out into also the cup that we did not put sugar into. So this cup here on the right has sugar and this cup does not. And that will be the 2 that we compare. I've poured the water into the first cup and now we're gonna get it underway with the second cup. If you guys notice, we're gonna take just a second to stir these boys up, make sure everything's all mixed together very well. And then we are going to take our left cup and pour it into our bottle on the left-hand side. I am just going to put you guys down for a second so I can get a good handle on both cups. Bleh, look at that water. Doesn't look very appetizing, huh? Can't imagine putting that into our bread. And then we're going to take the right cup. Make sure you guys can see what I'm doing here. And pour it into the right bottle. If you guys notice, it's starting to get a little bit bubbly at the bottom. It's frothing up because the yeast is soaking in. And we are going to take our yellow balloon and keeping careful to make sure that we are not sealing off the rest of the balloon. We are going to spread it right over the top of the bottle. Make a nice little seal so it stays on nice and tight. You guys see that? And then we're going to do the same thing to our other guy. And we'll let these bottles sit for, I want to say 30 minutes and see if we notice anything different. All right, you guys, so that experiment went very well. As you guys can see, the bottle that we used sugar in with the yeast went very well. And so the reason we took time to stop and do this experiment is because I want you guys to remember 3 very important things. The 3 most important things for you guys to remember about yeast today is that it's alive. If we don't give it the right temperatures, if we don't keep it nice and warm, and we don't keep it from getting too cold, it's not gonna do anything. It won't do what we need it to do because it won't be happy in those conditions. The second thing to remember is that it takes sugar, which as you guys can see, we put sugar in this bottle here and not in this bottle here. It takes sugar and it turns it into carbon dioxide, which you guys probably know most about as a gas or maybe as the carbonation in your sodas, but it's also very important when you make bread because it keeps the dough light and fluffy. So like when you guys bite into bread, you're not breaking your teeth because the yeast took the sugar that was in there and turned it into air and made it nice and fluffy for us. The third most important thing for us to remember that we just learned during our time-lapse video is that yeast takes time to work. while we're doing this recipe that we're about to do, we're gonna have a lot of times where we just need to stop and wait for the yeast to do what it needs to do. It's gonna be we're gonna stop to let the bread rise in the bowl 2 or 3 times, because it gives the yeast lots of time to take all the sugar that we put into the bread and turn it into carbon dioxide. All right, you guys, now we're gonna get to making bread. I'm just gonna stop for a second and take another look at the balloon because it's filled up even more from where it was before. It's actually made little popping noises a couple of times as it lets out the CO2. And if you look at the water level here, if you guys remember from before, the one with the sugar in it was down much lower than the one without sugar. This one has started to fill up with a kind of foaming, frothing solution as the yeast really gets into the fermentation process and starts cranking out the CO2. So I can expect to maybe check in on this a couple more times during the video, but it's really full, you guys. It's doing a very good job. And so on that note, actually, we are gonna stop and check in and make sure that our water is a good temperature. And we are gonna add 2 cups of water and 2 tablespoons of dry yeast into our big bowl. And we are gonna let them proof. And now proofing is just a fancy word for letting the yeast sit for 10 minutes and take the time that it needs to get started. Because if you guys remember for the first part of the whole video, not too much was happening in regards to the bottles, and then all of a sudden, it really started to fill up at the end. So we're gonna let our yeast proof. And so this water's coming in about 101 degrees, a little bit more than that. Not too bad, if I do say so myself. So I measured out 2 cups of water. And I'm gonna put you guys down for a hot second, my apologies. 2 cups of water, and we're gonna take straight from our little yeast container. So we are gonna be taking 2 full tablespoons, and I'm saying tablespoons, not teaspoons, of the yeast to mix into our warm water. It's important to go nice and slow. I usually pour over a nice dry bowl, so if I miss any, I can scoop that back up and use it again. So 1 full tablespoon in. And another full tablespoon in. If you guys want to just take a second and take a look, we're gonna mix all of this together. You guys notice it's already kind of getting clumpy. A couple big bubbles popping up here and there. The yeast is really starting to smell like bread. If you guys are doing this at home along with me, you guys will notice that it's clumping up a little bit, starting to dissolve, and it immediately starts to smell like bread. It's very, very delicious. And we're also just gonna take 2 full big heaping tablespoons of sugar to feed her. Ooh, that's not quite full. We wanna make sure our guy's getting lots of good food. There we go. 1. Sorry guys, I'm gonna put you down. And 2. And I'm just gonna set a timer for 10 minutes and let this sit and let the yeast get started so that by the time that we start adding in the flour, it'll be underway. Okay, so you guys, I've let the yeast sit in the bowl, if you want to take a closer look in here, for about 10 minutes. You guys notice there's a nice thick foam across the top. You can see the yeast has really gotten a chance to get started. We are gonna add the full tablespoon of salt now and mix it in. You guys see how foamy it is? It almost looks kind of like soda, like it's foaming right across the top like root beer. And so I have measured out 5 cups of flour over here for you guys. I did take the time to make sure I wasn't packing it in. Since I've already measured it out, I'm gonna show what happens if you guys pack in your flour. You're gonna get, if you look, I just pushed down and tamped it down. And I can pack the flour down and get way more than I need in the bowl. So it's important when you are scooping out and measuring your flour that you keep things light and you don't pack it in. You will get a lot more flour than you need and want, and you'll wind up with much denser bread, if that makes sense. Now that I've gone and stuck my hands in the flour, we're gonna stop and remember that it's very important for you to remove your bracelets and your rings before this portion of it. I've already washed my hands several times during this entire setup, But if you have anything on your wrist or your hands, they're gonna get very messy and make things a little bit dirtier. So let's just make sure, take a second to make sure our wrists and our hands are free of any ornaments. All right, so we are just gonna add the flour in a little bit at a time. I'm using a big tablespoon scoop and stirring it myself with a big old spoon. It's not gonna seem like you're doing too much at first, and it's gonna seem like you're maybe taking things a little bit too slow, but I assure you when we get later into the stirring process, you guys are gonna appreciate the fact that we're taking things a little bit slower. You guys hear the foaming? We do have a lot more yeast in this recipe than is typical. The reason we're using a recipe with such a high volume of yeast is because instead of having to let it rest for an hour or two and wait for the dough to rise, you're only gonna have to let this bread sit for about 15 minutes. You guys see it's starting to thicken up. The foaming has stopped and we're starting to get something kind of soupy, almost like what you'd find with slime. You guys notice the dough is starting to pull away from the edges of the bowl and get a lot harder to work with. So I'm gonna pour in the rest of the flour and finish balling up the dough. Looks like we're just about there. Pause. All right, so we are gonna knead the dough. We're gonna knead it for about 8 minutes. I've set a little piggy timer over here, so I'm not gonna have to use my phone. Kneading is the process of folding over the bread, pushing it down, folding it over again, pushing it back out, folding it back over. It's something that takes a little bit more muscle than you guys might think, but it's actually pretty soothing. It's very enjoyable. So we're doing this so that all the dough mixes together with the yeast and the sugar, and it gets a lot of time for all the strands of gluten inside of it to line up so that when we bake our bread, it's nice and cohesive. So I'm just gonna sit here and do this for 8 minutes. You guys can take turns doing this at home, trade off with a sibling or maybe a parent. Help make things a little bit easier for you guys. I did just lay out a little bit of parchment paper on my table so that I wouldn't have to worry about cleaning up afterwards. It does make things a lot easier and keep things from getting a little out of hand. All right, so I've worked the dough for here about 8 minutes now, and now I'm gonna take the bread bowl that we were using earlier and rub some olive oil on the inside so the bread doesn't stick. We're gonna take our freshly kneaded dough, place it in the bowl. We're gonna take a dish rag, which I just ran some warm water over, and we're gonna make a little roof for it over here. And we're gonna take it and we're gonna let it sit for 15 minutes somewhere warm. In this case, I'm gonna put it on top of the stove, which I have preheating to 400 degrees. So it'll be ready in about 15 minutes after we're done letting it rise. So we're just gonna take a second, stop, make a little timer, get our little piggy boy going, and we'll be right back. Goey. All right, guys, we've let our dough sit for about 20 minutes now, and it's not quite doubled in size, but we are gonna get underway. First thing you gotta do is the fun part. We're gonna punch it. And you guys see all the air is kind of come seeping out, and the dough's a lot lighter and airier across the board than it was before when we put it in. We are just gonna take a second and separate it out into about 2 equal halves. Gonna shape it up a little bit. We're gonna do 2 nice round loaves, I think. And we're gonna put it on our tray, which I've already sprinkled with a little bit of corn flour so that it's not gonna stick to anything. They're a lot lighter and fluffier than they were when we started. And we are actually just gonna take a second and turn over here and look at, I made a little boy at about 1/4 the entire recipe. I didn't add any yeast at all to this guy. If you guys wanna think what might maybe happen with this guy. look at how much smaller than he is. I used 1/4 of the flour overall, and he is much smaller than half the size of the other two boys, which are each half of the total recipe. So it'll be a little bit interesting. We are gonna take a knife and we're gonna make scores across the top at about 1/2 inch depth. What do you guys think this is gonna do? Do you think it's gonna help let the air out so that we don't maybe get any accidental explosions with the yeast? I think that might be nice. So we're gonna score right across the top and let a little bit of the extra air out so we don't have any problems later on. We're gonna take our cold water and just kind of wipe it across the top. And you guys don't have to do this part at home, but I really like everything seasoning. So I'm gonna take sesame seeds, poppy seeds, garlic, and a couple other things, and just kind of sprinkle that across the top because I enjoy it. Do you guys think we should put some seasoning on this guy down here? See how he goes? Yeah, might as well see. All right, do you guys want to take a moment and think about what do you guys think is going to happen with this guy that's not going to happen with these two over here? Cut. We are going to take a little bit of hot water and pour it into this pan down here. Before we put our bread in the oven, we want to make sure we have a nice pan of hot water that we're going to put in on the bottom shelf. That'll go underneath where we're cooking. So if you guys see, I've got my trays, my rack set up, so I have one down low for the steaming water and one up a little bit higher for the dough. And we're gonna let these guys cook for about 40 to 50 minutes. I'm gonna take the smallest one out early because it's about half the size, so at about 25 to 30 minutes, I'm gonna go in and check on it and make sure that he's doing okay. But otherwise, we're gonna take a couple of still photos at different parts in the cooking process so that you guys can get a chance to see what's happening. Bye, guys. All right, our bread looks like it's just about done. And just a little bit, once these guys have cooled off a little bit more, we'll pull them apart and really compare. They're a little bit too hot to really do anything with right now, but these guys expanded out. You guys see how along the cut marks, I did a better job on this one. The bread expanded out and kept it from tearing like it did on this side over here. So it was pretty useful stuff. See you in just a little bit. All right, so I'm about to cut into our two different types of bread. This is the one that we didn't add any yeast to at all. I wound up cooking it the entire time just because it doesn't seem to have really finished up what it needs to do. Even leaving it in a little bit longer didn't quite do it. And this is the slightly less pretty of our two loaves that I'm just gonna cut into here so we can get a good idea of what it looks like on the inside. And so I'm gonna take a quick peek. We can see all the little air bubbles where the yeast did its good job and made a lot of carbon dioxide for us and kept the bread nice and light and fluffy. It's got a lot of squish to it. I'm very excited to be eating that today. Oh, that's not the bread knife. And then here's our other little boy, which if you guys could notice, it's not cooked all the way through. It is essentially a solid mass of flour. It's not going to be very good to eat. I'm probably not going to wind up eating this. Maybe we'll see if some birds will eat it. But as you guys can see, yeast is a very important part of the bread making process. If it wasn't inside here making all the little air bubbles, we wouldn't have a big chunk of yummy, delicious bread. We'd have a big chunk of sad, squishy dough. So appreciate your yeast.